Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. I'm Michael Ryder. Welcome to the Hugh Leach Memorial Lecture, which this year will be given by Dr. Saud Al-Sarhan. We had expected originally to be able to hold this event in April, but as all of our plans were disrupted by the pandemic, and as Dr. Al-Sarhan would have much preferred to deliver his talk in person in London, we postponed the event, hoping that the autumn might give us the opportunity to meet again face to face. As everyone knows, that has not happened and seems unlikely to happen yet for many months. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Al-Sarhan for his willingness to give this talk online. And it does have the advantage that many of you in the audience today who would not have been able to take part in a meeting in London can join us to hear what promises to be a fascinating presentation. There is an irony in this which will be apparent to anyone who knew Hugh Leach. Hugh and internet technology did not get on, and he saw no reason to be apologetic about that. At a talk he gave at the Society about the missionary Joseph Wolfe, he proudly declared, "I cannot tell an email from a snail or a blog from a frog." I do not know if he would have been amused or indignant to find himself celebrated through the media that he so cheerfully disdained. But one thing we do know about the Society's adoption of online webinars is that they are connecting the Society with a younger generation, and that is something about which Hugh was most passionate. So I would like to think that he would recognize the value of the medium, even if he did not embrace it himself. Today's topic is one which Hugh Leach would certainly have attached much importance to, and it is close to much of his own work. Dr. Saud Al-Sarhan is the Secretary General of the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, a position he has held since 2016. He is a member of the board of the Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute of Diplomatic Studies at the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of the Advisory Council for Countering Terrorism and Extremism at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and he is a member of the editorial board of the Asian Journal of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. He's also an honorary senior research fellow at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at Exeter University, where he gained his own doctorate. He's a Distinguished International Affairs Fellow at the National Council on US-Arab Relations and an Associate Fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. In 2019, he published Political Quietism in Islam, Sunni and Shi'i Practice and Thought, and it is on that subject that he speaks to us today. The title of his talk is Political Quietism in Islamic Societies, a Neglected Tradition. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome him today. And with that, I will hand over to him. Saud.
Thank you, Michael. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm extremely honored to be speaking to this prestigious society today. And I'm also delighted and grateful to have been invited to give Hugh Leach Memorial Lecture for 2020. Leach was a man of many talents and abilities. Soldier, diplomat, scholar, historian, writer, traveler, and explorer, as well as being a renowned Arabist and photographer. And I would like to take this opportunity to wish you, Michael, and your distinguished guests, season's greetings. In this talk, I will share some introductory thoughts and remarks on the vast topic of political quietism in Islamic societies. To do this, I will address briefly the following questions. How was quietism formulated in Islamic thought? When was the term quietism introduced in the field of Islamic studies and why? How did quietism evolve, becoming orthodoxy amongst most Muslims? And finally, why I believe quietism has contemporary relevance. There are many terms in Islamic thought to show different aspects of different form of activism, actions and beliefs. Some of them is bughat, rebel. Khuruj, and literally means going out, and that to go out to fight against the community or against the rulers. And sometimes khuruj also is not about the action, it's about the belief itself. And Khawarij, and the very famous sect in early Islamic period. And Thawra, which means uprising, fitna, sedition, or civil war. But when we go to Quietism, we find there are no equivalent term for it in Arabic. However, the concept itself, it can be found in other important concepts in Islamic thought. One of the concepts that can be understood Quietism from is Jama'ah, community. It means to adhere to the community. Ta'ah, it means obedience to the law and the rulers and the state. Bay'ah, allegiance, to pledge allegiance and to observe your allegiance to the rulers. Al-Aman, safety and security. So why there is no certain term for Quietism in Arabic? One explanation for that is that maybe in general Islamic Orthodox or the mainstream, or what we call the Jama'ah, only the things that are diverted from the mainstream, they will be labeled, like Khawarij, and they will get the name of the Khawarij, or maybe Mu'tazila, or Qadariyya, or Murji, etc., and etc. But the mainstream, they don't have a name, because they are the mainstream. Therefore, from the beginning, from the 9th century, which is the 3rd Islamic century, the Sunni creeds, they have an article always to say, we don't deem using swords against anyone of the Muslim community. So that this article is to show the Quietism, but in a passive way, because there is no term for a Quietism. So they describe Quietism by being passive from activism. And using sword is not literally, it means to use violence against the state and against the community. So when the term was introduced into Islamic thought, before that, I want just to put it into a context before saying the exact timing that the term was first time used in Islamic studies. And we can divide the modern Islamic thought into certain categories. And I just want to make sure, just to draw your attention, this is not organized in a chronological order, because they can be overlapped and it can not examine, just to give you an overview. The first is the liberal age, as the Oxford professor Albert Hourani named it in his famous book, Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age. And that the general character of that period is a reform within Islam. When the Islamic countries being colonialized by Western power, some Muslims start to think, why we are colonialized, we need to think to reform our society, our education, and our law. And that was not linked to the Arabic countries, but what is studied in Albert Hourani, and at that time, I think it's called in Arabic An-Nahdha time. But also in Central Asia, we have the Jadidism movement. And in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, the reformists. So the question at that period, it was a question of reform. But the age after that is been named by some scholars as the age of ideologues. And that when we see the political Islam parties started to be established. At that time of Hassan al-Banna, al-Mawdudi, Sayyid Qutb, and when the establishment of Islamic parties like Muslim Brotherhood and etc. And the question here, it was the Islamization of the government, to have an Islamic government. And that will remind us of the book by Imam Khomeini, because these ideologues, they are Sunnis and Shia alike. When he wrote his book, The Islamic Government, in 1969. But after that, then we have another generation, what I called it, the counter revival. And in this time, the idea was not just to have an Islamization of a government, but also to have an Islamization of Muslim societies. So the Muslim societies were not Islamic enough for these people, and they wanted to make it more Islamic by taking over the society, the education, and other. And that started after the war of 1967, when many people thought to return to Islam, and after the defeat of Egypt and Syria in the war. And that this period also represents the foundation of the so-called Sahwa, what we know in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf, with other Muslim Islamic parties in Egypt and North Africa. The Iranian Revolution happened at that period, and these, when they started, became more aggressive and aggressive, these movements. So the term Islamic, or the term into Islamic studies, appeared first in that period of time. And those of you who lived in the region know that how powerful these Islamic movements were at that time. But after that, then we had that time, the age of violence and jihad, when the jihad in Afghanistan against the Russians started, and the violence by these fundamentalists is not only against the state, but also against the society. Because they saw the state is an Islamic state, and we know the assassination of Sadat in 1981, but also it was a violence against the intellectuals and thinkers. We know the assassination of Faraj Fawda in 1992, the attempt to assassinate Najib Mahfouz in 1995, and the rejection is not only the intellectuals and the state, but also the traditions, the Islamic traditions and the ulama. And we remember the assassination of the Egyptian Sheikh Al-Dhahabi, who was kidnapped and killed by this movement in 1977. After that, all of you know about the global jihad with Al-Qaeda, and the shock that happened to all of us with the rise of ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State, and the savagery that's been happening. And this is a title of a book written by one of them. It's called The Management of Savagery. And these ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they shocked the bonds of Muslim societies, and they destroyed also the relationship between Muslims and the West. And another thing can be mentioned here before going that, as I maybe told Michael, the attack on Islam is also an attack on the concept of Islam. When now we're speaking about jihad, everyone will associate it with the violence against others. And when we speak about ISIS, Islamic State, it's a state of terror. Not only that, but when you go to a normal word like fatwa now is associated with many people with the idea of giving a license to kill. And I was surprised to see an article on the CNN just to explain that fatwa is just to give an opinion, not automatically to give an order to kill. So, and look, maybe when you look in the dictionaries for a word like Allahu Akbar, what does it mean? You see many of the Muslims or Islamic term being disturbed by the movement of this of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others. But that is another story. We will go back now to the term Quietism when it was introduced into Islamic studies field. So the first time the term Quietism was introduced in the field of Islamic studies, to my knowledge, is in 1981 in the chapter written by the famous American and I think British also Orientalist Michael Cook, in his chapter Activism and Quietism in Islam, in a book titled Islam and Power. He said, Islam, as everyone knows, is a political religion. Activism is given in Islam. Here, in contrast to Christianity, it is the quietists who have to work to provide themselves with excuses. What Michael Cook said here, it has been criticized by some scholars. One of them is that Michael brought the term Quietism from a different field. It was brought from the Catholic mysticism in Spain in the 17th century and brought directly to a different field, which is the political Islamic thought, without explanation how he did that. However, people started to use it from that time, and it became a normal usage to use this Quietism. But if you see here, he spoke about Islam as a religion. He didn't speak about traditions inside Islam. He didn't speak about some societies. He gave it a general statement about Islam and said, as everyone knows, is it given. And he said activism is given in Islam. So he made the Islam is an activist political religion. And this statement surely was impacted by the period I just mentioned, when the rise of all these fundamentalists in Islamic world. In the introduction of the book, Islam and Power, the editors make it very clear the book was written in response to try to understand the Iranian Revolution, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and other Islamic groups they were formed at that period. But from that time, 1981, the term has been used widely in the Islamic studies field. And famously was this quotation from the famous Bernard Lewis in an article he wrote. It's called Islamic Revolution. And he spoke about two traditions in Islam. One of them is quietist, and that mainly in the Sunnah, and activist mainly in the Shia. And also here, Bernard Lewis was explaining the Islamic Revolution of Iran. So he was speaking about the Iranian Revolution, and that's why he was mentioning that thing. So what we noticed that in most of the topics, Quietism was being studied and analyzed through the prism of activism. It's not about itself, but it was as the main was activism, and Quietism was on the margin of it. And surprisingly, most of the articles been written and books been written about the Quietism since then, it was associated with two groups. We see them in the opposite of each other, but the main writing was about one of these two groups with the association with the Quietism. These two groups are the Salafis and the Shia. So if you think more than 90% of the article is about the Salafi Quietist or the Shia Quietist. And by 2012, I think it became an official term in Islamic studies when it was included in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Islamic Political Thought. So in our book that was published in 2019, Political Quietism in Islam, Sunni and Shia Practice and Thought, we wanted to show it's a very important tradition inside Islam. And it's not just one monolithic tradition that can be described or associated with Sunnah or Salafism or Shiism. It's a very wide tradition, and it has many ways of showing itself. So we studied from it's around the 12 chapters. We studied from the beginning of the early Islamic Caliphate, the Khulafa Rashidin, until today's women preachers in Da'iyat in Saudi Arabia, from the debate after the fall of Shamil's imamate in Dagestan to the discussion on constitution in 19th century of Tunisia, Golan movement in Azerbaijan, and others. So we wanted to show this is a wide range of tradition of Quietism in Islamic society, and this book was an attempt to show that. So why Quietism? In my previous research, because I did my PhD at Exeter University on the political thought of Ahmed bin Hanbal, on the political Quietism of Ahmed bin Hanbal, it's more than 10 years ago. In my research, I found this Quietism became an orthodox in the Sunni thought in the mid-9th century, the third Islamic century. Also, it became an orthodox in the Shi'i thought maybe later on, but both the Sunnis and the Shia, they reached the same conclusion from a different route. So here I just want to show about why Quietism became an orthodox or the mainstream Sunni thought. And I was surprised to see in my research that maybe it's not the text, not the Quran or the Sunnah who led the Muslim societies to reach the conclusion of Quietism. Actually, it was the experience of the historical memory of the society that make it to be the mainstream thought in the Sunnis. For example, this it's the historical memory and experience. In the first civil war in Islam, what is named as Fitna, from 656 to 661, it was shocked the Muslims. Maybe until today, it became a most important topic because it's the first time the Muslim society divided, and they fought each other, and the companion of the Prophet fought each other. But for the Quietists, there are actually three groups, not two groups they fought, were involved. This the two groups, they fought each other, and the third is those who didn't involve in the fitna and didn't take part. And for the Quietists, those who didn't take part in the fitna and in the fight were the righteous. And those who fought each other, it is not who was right or not who was wrong, but the fighting itself was wrong. So we don't need to see who was maybe on the right side, who was right and who was wrong. And that was more clearer in the Second Civil War from 680 to 692. It's not the companion, but the second generation. But some of the companions Quietist companions who avoid the first fitna were still alive. And one of them is Ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn Khattab, the second Islamic caliph. A man went to him and asked him, which group should I fight with? Because it's logically one of them is right and the other is wrong. Ibn Umar answered, if you fought and were killed, you would go to hell, regardless which party you fought with. So the fighting itself is wrong, and you should not take part in that fighting. And another element that influenced the Sunni thought at that time is the failed uprisings. Most of the uprising failed and didn't reach their conclusion. And the state had to take revenge for those who fight. So this history of failed uprising that influenced the thinking. But not only that, also for the Quietists, they believed even if the upriser they will succeed, they will not be better than the current ruler they are fighting against. They said they will be the same of them. And third, the Quietists view that such conflict were not for religious purposes. It's mainly for wealth and power. So even if the rebels were having a just cause, or they may be calling for religious purposes for their uprising, the Quietists believe this is only for wealth and power, and we should not take part of it. And there are lots of quotations from Ibn Umar and others to support this idea. The most important issue also of the Quietism and the Quietists is that their main concern is not power, is not government, like we see to have an Islamization of the government. Their main interest was the community itself, the society, its security, safety, and the protection of the common people. We know that time when Al-Ma'mun became a caliph, he decided to declare that the Quran is created, and against the common belief of the Sunnis that the Quran is not created, it's God's word. So, and the caliph after him, Al-Mu'tasim, then Al-Wathiq, they continue in the same beliefs. At the time of Al-Wathiq, Al-Wathiq decided to do that this doctrine should be taught to the children in schools, that the Quran is created. So some of the people of the Sunnah in Baghdad at the time, they came to Ahmad bin Hanbal to ask him to join them to fight against this heresy. Ahmad told him not to do so, but they were insisting. So this is a quotation from Ahmad bin Hanbal. I will read it to you. He said, "Glory be to God. Shedding blood. So he was warning against shedding blood. I do not consent, nor do I command it. Observing patience in our situation is better than sedition, fitna, that causes shedding of blood, plundering of wealth, and violation of prohibition." I think it means assaulting women. So for Ahmed, this is the most important thing, to protect the common people, because these people on the street, they will suffer any kind of sedition or unrest that will happen in Baghdad at that time. Their shops will be plundered, their houses will be threatened, and their street will not be safe. But he didn't talk about what about the belief of the ruler or other thing. So people told him, what about the religious? This guy is trying to attack our belief. He said, you should rather condemn this heresy in your heart, but not remove your hand from allegiance, divide the unity of the Muslims, or shed your blood or Muslim blood with yours. So for him, the salvation is, the religious salvation is individual. You can do it yourself. But the security of the community is a collective responsibility. And that is completely different from this fundamentalist who believe that the individual salvation cannot be happen without taking the community with you and enforce it to the community. So why then I will come to the final point is why I believe this is relevant to our days. I think the Muslim societies now are retired societies because of these waves and waves and waves of fundamentalism. There is tension between self and self. Being a pious person, that is something to be in individualism. But for these people, no, you have to show it outside. So it's a tension between being yourself and a pious, or to show it outside. And there is tension between self and community. Because if you are being the right religious person or a pious person, you have to take the community. You have to impose your opinion on the community. And that makes lots of tension. And also now the tension between self and state. That's why lots of government don't trust the fundamentalists, and these fundamentalists, they don't trust the government. And we see lots of tensions and attacks. And now also the tension between Muslims and the West. These fundamentalists, the Qaeda and ISIS and other, they started this kind of attack and hate between Muslims and the West, and the distrust between both parties. And I said even the concept of Islamic tradition were corrupt by giving an extremist meanings. And we see now there are hundreds of journals and books and articles talking about jihad as a violent thing, and extremism and terrorism. But there is very few articles and books talking about Islamic traditions that support peace and tolerance. And I will give an example of that. When I was speaking about the translation of Quietism, it doesn't have an equivalent meaning in Arabic. When I did some thought, and I translated into a word, similar word to called muwada'a, for example. But when I read a very nice review of the book in an Arabic newspaper, that the writer translated it into a word, peace. And this peace is not the right translation of Quietism, but it's the ultimate goal of Quietism, to have a peace between self and self, to have peace between self and community, and to have peace between self and state, and also to have peace with others. So many Islamic, or lots of the Islamic thinkers, they were not happy with this fundamentalist. And it was the call to return to the traditions. We have this from Sayyid Hussein Nasr and others. And the term traditional Islam also became used more frequently since the late 90s and the late 1980s. And I think Quietism is one of these traditions that need to be studied and to be introduced to Muslims. And I will finish with this picture. I like the photo that Michael put for this lecture. It's on the right, colorful, peaceful, and pious people praying, and we have similar thing on the left. But I would say the one on the right is a quietist prayer, and the one on the left, it has been taken from Alexandria University. in 1977 is an Islamic fundamentalist taking over the stadium to pray. And the difference is that the people on the right, they are praying for prayer, for a pious, for piety and pious reasons. But the people on the left, they were praying to show power. They took over the stadium. They didn't go to pray in the mosque with the imam. They just want to do it to show their power to others. And I think this I will conclude. And thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Saud, for that wonderful tour through the history of Quietism. It is always interesting to discover that concepts that exist with apparent clarity in one language or cultural context are absent in others. Even more interesting, I think, when that other culture finds a need to create the same concept. We have a few questions lined up here. Lucien Kirchhoff has asked a couple of questions. Dr. Al-Sarhan, do you have any thoughts about the Quietism of the Madkhalist branch of Salafism in Saudi Arabia? And slightly more specifically, do you think the Madkhalists differ from the mainstream Quietist Salafism in terms of an extreme obedience to the rulers?
Yeah, thank you. I think usually the Madkhalis became a sample of Quietism, but they are not the only way, or they are not the only movement that can be described as Quietist. So the Madkhalis, for those who maybe are not familiar with them, they've been related to the Sheikh Rabi' al-Madkhali from Saudi Arabia, and they believe in the obedience to the ruler, but they're also against all kinds of political Islamic movements. As I mentioned in my talk, most of the research has been done about Quietism related this concept to one of the two groups, Shi'ism or Salafism, and the Madkhalis is one of these two. But the difference between Madkhalis and other maybe Quietists, the Quietists, they in general, they don't want to intervene in politics, to support or to be against. It's two kinds of field. The one field is the social field. They are working with the community, but the politics and the politicians are different field from them. The Madkhalis, they are not part of an activism, but they became an activist to fight against other movements. Of course, now some of the people who've been ascribed to the Madkhalis in Libya and others, they involved in fighting. And as I said from the beginning, Ahmed bin Hanbal has this. Ahmed bin Hanbal has very clear that shedding and involving in blood and fight is something should be prohibited.
Thank you. Picking up a question from Marcus Hope. He asks, do you see variations of Quietism in non-Arab Islamic societies?
Yes, I think, as I mentioned, it's a very important tradition that can be found in all Islamic societies. And in our book, we mentioned, I think, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and other, and also there, if you see, for example, in India, when the famous unity in 1857, there are some Muslims, they didn't want to take part of the fighting, even that, because it's the general idea is that the fighting and the involvement in politics, it can be done on a national interest, a partial interest, an ethnical interest, but should not be done on a religious interest, because that is different from religious itself. So yes, it can be found in Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and Central Asia. There are lots of Quietists in that area.
Thank you. So Harold Walker asks, when Prince Mohammed bin Salman talks about a return to a moderate Islam, is he talking about Quietism?
I'm not quite sure what he meant, because that maybe a question can be asked to him, but he wanted to go back to general traditional Islam. So it's not just to the Quietism, because it's just one tradition among others. So what I understand from the statement of Prince Mohammed bin Salman, it's similar to what I bought from Sayyid Nasser, is to go back to the concept of traditional Islam, and that's the time before the fundamentalism taking over the Islamic societies. So that will include the Quietism, that will include following the four schools of madhabs and other kind of traditional Islam can be known.
Thank you. And I mean, this is, I guess, connected, at least in substance. Malik Al-Abdi asks, given the backlash against political Islam, both Sunni and Shia, following the Arab Spring, how do you read the current fortunes of the Quietist tradition? Is it likely to regain control of mainstream Islam?
I think the so-called Arab Spring is an important example to show what the Quietists said it was right. It is people can revolt or can do maybe uprising, but not to have it under the name of the religion. And that because that will attack the religion itself, and that will attack also the society. When the people went out on the street in Egypt, in Cairo, or in Tunisia, it was for economic, political needs, but then had been hijacked by political Islamic movements. And that also, and that maybe attack both the revolution itself and attack Islam and other. So I think it's very important now to save the mainstream Islam from being taken by opportunists like political Islamic movements.
A question from Bijan Umrani, who's the editor of the Society's Journal. He says the despiritualization of religion and its use as an ideological marker is something very pronounced in the West, let alone Islam. Is it likely, in your view, that a re-spiritualization would ever be possible, either in the Islamic world or otherwise, despite the pressures of modernity in politics? And I ask the question, Bijan comments, remembering Hugh Leach's deep appreciation of the spirituality of Islam.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think that can be possible if we believe that salvation and spirituality is individual, the individual choice. It's not something that someone have to take the society and to impose it on the society. In this case, we can return the importance to the spirituality of Muslims and in the West and in the Islamic areas.
A more straightforwardly factual question, I guess, here from Frail Alaji. What is the difference between Sufism and Quietism?
Yeah, well, the word Quietism, when it came from Christianity, it came from, I would say, a Sufi Christian. It was from a discussion on the prayers and that. So that's why the term itself has a Sufi heritage. And Schopenhauer, I think, mentioned that there's a Quietism in Islam. It means the Sufis and Buddhism and Christianity. But in the Sunni, in the Muslim, in the Islamic context, in the Islamic studies context, Sufis can be part of the Quietism, but they are not the Quietists. They are not only the Quietists, because it's very wide spectrum to use it for different groups of Muslim societies.
Let me follow up with a question from Yusuf Al-Daini. The concept of fitna and fear of societal rifts was born within the confines of the Islamic State. And I take it here that he does not mean the organization Islamic State, but rather the Islamic states generally. Why did fear of political turmoil not develop in the modern era, especially among Muslim minorities living in the West?
I think the concept fitna, to avoid fitna, and if you notice in my presentation, the word fitna appeared many times because it's something that someone should be warned against. And the fitna, it can be in sedition or civil war, etc. So I think the Muslims in the West, they are part of their societies. And I'm not here to teach them what to do, but it's I'm sure they have their own organization that are working with the other societies. But I just want to mention here the name Islamic State, and it's similar to the Islamic Revolution. It's something is not quite right. There is a state of Muslim majority people and a state of non-Muslim majority people, and also there is no religious for any kind of revolution. So the revolution, it can be the Iranian Revolution or can be the French Revolution, but it's not Islamic. So that we need also to clear the concept from being attached to something is not quite accurate.
Turning for a moment to Shia traditions, William Crawley asks, is it the case that before the mid-20th century, the leading Shia clerics in Iran did not claim the right to rule or see it as their responsibility to decide on issues of government? Would you describe this stance as quietist?
Yes, absolutely. And from the 1983, there were books about the Shia tradition being quietist. Very important books by very leading scholars at the period until today, because this is the idea of wilayat al-faqih. It came from the Shia fundamentalists. It's not from the Shia traditionalists. And the Shia fundamentalists, they wanted to take part in power, and that's why it's similar to the Sunni fundamentalists. They want to take over the government. So in general, the Shia were quietist, and we have several chapters about that in our book.
Well, that leads very nicely on to a related question from Anthony Wynne. Could you comment, he asks, on the dispute between the traditional Shia quietists and the followers of Wilayat al-Faqih propounded by Khomeini?
I think there, of course, maybe it's not. They're different between the quietist, can be said by the traditional Marji'iyya in Najaf and even in Iran itself, against the new fundamentalist idea came with the Imam Khomeini to have an Islamic state. And as I mentioned, Khomeini in 1969, he published his book, The Islamic Government. and that is against the traditional Shia thought since the 10th century, not to get involved in politics. So that is a very, very wide, well-known among even the Shia scholars themselves. They know this is a kind of non-traditional way of leading the community.
Geordie Burnett Stewart asks, does Salafism allow quietism in its worldview?
I think that maybe the Salafism have had a very narrow worldview that might not let the quietism in. But the majority of articles on quietism, it was to discuss with Salafism itself. And even I think it was Levy who in his book, he was also speaking about ultra-quietism, ultra-quietist in the Salafis. So I think that Salafism is a very wide range of thought. It's not one thinking, even if they wanted to describe themselves as one way of thinking, but they can come from jihadist up to quietist. And I think the majority of the Salafis are quietist.
I'm going to, I think, draw to a close at that point. Dr. Al-Sarhan's book is available, and I have just posted in the chat channel a link to the Bloomsbury website where at the moment you can obtain it at a small discount in both hardback and ebook forms. While you are there, could I also draw your attention to a button on the chat channel. The RSAA's ability to run events like this and to maintain its independence is entirely dependent on the support that we receive from those who, like you, care about understanding Asia. So if you can, please do consider clicking on that link. Any donation, however small, helps to ensure that we can continue to advance knowledge of Asia as we have for over 100 years. We will be back on the 6th of January when Ike Fryman will be talking about China's rewriting of the history of the Silk Road as an aid to its political aims. Until then, I wish you all a safe time through the current challenges of the Christmas season. A warm thank you to Dr. Al-Sarhan for this outstanding talk, and to you, the audience. You are the reason that we do this. Until January, goodbye.
Bye-bye.